cognitive scientist and computer programmer Dr. Justin Lane, and the scientific director of NORSE for the Center for Modeling Social Systems. Also, was it the founding member of the AI
Center for AI Research.
Center for AI Research. Thank you for correcting me. And dual doctorate, LaRon Schultz. Again, every single week I introduce you, that never ceases to amuse me. And also terrify me.
I like how you say it in different ways every week.
Yes,
Dual
indeed.
doctorate. That was the first time.
It was new. That was new. That was nice.
Double Dr. LaRon coming to you live from Topia. Thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, so we decided that we are going to talk about, well, our title at least is NATO and Nationalism. And I think just to recap what was shared right before we went live, would you like to share a little bit about what is coming up, what is about to be published, where it's going to be published, and where you can tune in to a specific podcast to hear it be discussed?
So, with the who, what, and where of a specific podcast, we have a paper coming out. It's a white paper that's coming out with Minds.com. It's going to be published on their website. We're going to link to it from our website. There's a couple of other partners that will also all link to it. It was a collaborative effort between LaRon and I at Culture Pulse, the heads at Minds.com, which is an alternative social media network, and multiple de-radicalization groups, like nonprofit organizations that focus on de-radicalization from like religious extremism and ethno-nationalist groups, racial hate groups, etc. And it's basically going to be featured in a lot of places. Some of the things we can mention, but it looks like it's also going to be discussed on the Joe Rogan Experience for the March the 10th, I believe. That's the current scheduling. We'll see if it gets changed.
And so how does this tie into our title for today?
So one of the ways that it ties in is that one of the forms of extremism that has been on the rise is nationalism. But one of the reasons why things like nationalism and social stability have been so fragile over the last few years has to do a lot with the news cycles and the information and the misinformation that's out there about different places. And the media is used to justify and then unjustify a lot of things from all different sides. And as Russia moves troops into the Ukraine over the last 24 to 48 hours, you see media spin on both sides. Both those who are for the move, those who are against the move. In the United States, everyone's against the move, but they're yelling about whether or not that Biden's response is a legitimate response, or whether or not this is just a waste of time and resources. And they're arguing largely just to make political theater. They're not really dealing with the facts on the ground. So it's creating a lot of noise in the social media space that needs to be cut through before we can get to a ground truth on which we could actually build and move forward on a policy level.
So before we get into talking about a potential ground war, let's talk about the cyber warfare that's been deployed over the last few years and what you've seen in terms of countering that, not necessarily in one particular side, but just de-escalating.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the particular saga that we have going on here, one of the main things that everyone goes back to, right, is looking at the Russian troll farms during the 2016 election, where Russia was making a very concerted effort to, as the general narrative says, right, influence the U.S. election. But people say that on both sides of the aisle as if they mean influence them to lose and for the other side to win. And when you look at the data, really, that's not exactly what they were doing. All of the evidence from the data that's there, and so we do have a copy of the about 3 million or so of the Russian troll farm tweets and have analyzed and looked through them. What you see is actually people trying to just sow the seeds of chaos. The idea was not to get one side or the other elected. In my personal opinion, I don't think Putin wanted Trump or Clinton to become president for different reasons. Clinton was predictable, but predictably against Russia, and had been for a while, but would cooperate on certain things because she has networks that go through that region. Trump was unpredictable and that's one of the things that he doesn't that Putin wouldn't like. He's a very risk averse leader generally when you look at his foreign policy historically, and so having a guy who's kind of a loose cannon and will say one thing one day and then 3 hours later turn around and say the exact opposite doesn't make for a very risk off environment when you're thinking of invading a new country, right? So on the back of Crimea, a lot of people were saying, he wasn't going to stop at Crimea. He always wanted, like the Donetsk Republic, which is where he's currently controlling land, but didn't go in during Trump because he had no idea
Hmm.
what was going to happen if he did. With Biden, I think he did have a better understanding of what he did. In the troll farm, though, what you see is just the moment they could find something and give something a megaphone that would cause one side to fight the other, that was what they wanted.
Yeah.
So their intention was just to breed chaos. The idea wasn't to have one side win. The idea really was to have both sides lose.
Right. Yeah, and it seems that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that creating this separation within, nation states, they're within their enemies essentially. They're weaker, right? So like Biden has to fight more in order to take any action because the country that Biden presides over at this time is fractured, and that fracturing comes from the strategies that Russia implemented. And so
Yeah.
when you get
Yeah.
your enemy fighting itself, then you have to do less work.
To an extent, yeah. I think that's the long game for
Yeah.
sure. The short game is a little bit more complicated, of course, right? Because the executive branch, right, the power lies fairly concentratedly with the president at this point, right? He is basically a singular executive that has extreme overreaching powers that allow them to do things like make laws even for the economy without actually having to go through Congress anymore. Most military actions, right, like the last time we got an actual declaration of war was in the Korean War. That's how long ago it was. So he can address short-term movements of adversaries. So the president of the U.S., that is. So if the president of Russia, or whoever holds the power, if Putin decides to become the prime minister again, then all of a sudden the prime minister holds all of this power, and then he'll go back and forth like he has for the last 20 years. So whoever holds the power in Russia, if they want to move forces into the Ukraine, the U.S. president does have the ability to act with the power of a singular executive. He is commander in chief. From a long-term perspective, though, sowing that discord, it affects not just the elections, but it affects the national cohesion. Americans lost the taste for war a long time ago, but now they're losing the taste for the leadership that they need to trust to maintain
Yeah,
any
it's
sort of
well,
action.
well said.
Mm. So how do you see nationalism being de-escalated on both sides, and who do you see as being the most effective character to do that?
In the context of
The
Russia and the
global
Ukraine,
theater.
or the
Yeah.
global theater.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the context of the global theater, I think one of the things that needs to actually happen is a reframing of the idea of nationalism.
Mm.
Um, Currently, the idea of nationalism is kind of viewed in terms of what in religions, right, they call like apostates, or heretics in a way, right? You're a nationalist because the other people that are in your country that also identify with your nation, they're not really part of the nation, right? So Republicans will say we're true Americans, those Democrats aren't real Americans, and Democrats will say, like, we support American values, those Republicans don't, they're not real Americans. And that sort of thing is really kind of the issue. I think that what people need to do is stop looking towards their local identity and assuming that their local identity has to be representative of the whole nation, and they need to understand that there are general overarching values that can be used to bind a nation together. Things like believing in, rule of law, the ability to have prosperity, self-determination, freedom of speech. These things are really critical to creating a national identity, at least in the United States. In other countries, of course, you have different key totemic beliefs, or key cornerstone beliefs that build that identity, but in all nations they need to deal with that as opposed to dealing with things that are more related to like identity politics or populism.
Mm.
because everyone is a have or have not in some way. And that's effectively
Yeah.
what populism is it's just defining that you are the have not and some other person is the have and you need to take them down.
So who do you think is the character to lead this de-escalation of nationalism? Like, and it certainly doesn't seem like it can be one country. And I think it's easy to say that it can be the technology companies that have enabled this. But their motivations are elsewhere.
Oh yeah, they stopped caring long ago. I mean, they're actively making it worse, and they know it, and they're still
Yeah.
doing it. They just don't care. Not all tech companies, but some of the big ones for sure. I
Shout
think
out to the new Boeing documentary on Netflix.
ooh, I'll have to watch that. I haven't seen it
Yeah.
Me
yet.
either.
I think it's dangerous to try and consider that any one person could de-escalate this. I don't think it's going to be about a person, and one of the reasons is because individual leaders throughout history, right? They call this like the big man approach to history, right?
Mm.
There's always one guy that changes the world. It's always Napoleon did this, Napoleon did that. And it's like, did he though? Or did he lead an army of like tons of people that had a huge effect on the world? And a lot of times people concentrate on the leaders with undue they give undue weight to the leader and not enough weight to all of the things that were kind of emerging around that leader. In the case of nationalism, unless you have nationalist cults, right? Like in China, you've seen this. North Korea is the clearest example of this, but Russia is very clearly like a nationalist cult that's built around Putin and his oligarchs. Um, those people they just serve to make it worse because they become the identity belief, and you either believe in the leader or you don't, and the leader becomes the nation. And that's the exact sort of dangerous issue that we're discussing, right? Because these are people, these aren't ideals, and those people have
So
failures.
so there's a video that we really like that's based on an article that we really like that talks about this concept of a cloud country. And so they
Hmm.
talk about the different ways to start a country, and the manner that they kind of discuss is this element of cloud countries. And they kind of
Hmm.
highlight that, like, hey, look, these social platforms have millions of users and millions of people, is on par with that of a nation. And fundamentally, when you have all of those people, agree to a set of agreements, right, to create that collective identity, then they can all kind of come together as one. So
Hmm.
what does it look like in this context? What does it look like to leave the frame of nationalism by creating basically a non-geographic nation, right? So a polystate, something that exists without geographic borders. And then how does the power of that entity change when it's, and I hesitate to use this word, decentralized,
Hmm.
because that has its own cult following. Um,
Yeah.
what happens when you de-emphasize the ability for any one person to lead, and you focus on mission, and same as like Bitcoin, where Satoshi is anonymous, and you see a lot
Hmm.
of like venture funds that are now investing in startups that don't have CEOs.
Hmm. Yeah, I think this is one of those things where
I said blockchain, and we like emptied out all of our watchers. Sorry.
and it's like, I'm out.
If I say it,
Screw
if I
this.
say it 3 more times, we might get them all back.
Well, at least we'll get Giggle Dragon. Um, so
Cryptocurrency,
yeah,
cryptocurrency,
it's
cryptocurrency.
cryptocurrency. Let me get my sunglasses real quick. So one of the one of the one of the things that happens actually is kind of like a beautiful chaos when you get rid of the idea of a person and then you move towards ideals, right? Because not everyone can necessarily relate to a person. Maybe they just have different personalities. Maybe that person said something ignorant in the past. Maybe that person does something that you don't like, and it allows you to kind of discredit the other people that follow them by discrediting the leader. But if you focus more on values, you kind of set up these ideas of like, we're not looking towards a person to lead us, we're looking towards ideals to lead us. And that's a much more stable thing to do because, one, it allows you to create and build institutions like governance institutions, like, an executive branch, for example, where an office can be held by a person And different people can go through that over time without destabilizing the leadership structure itself. If the leadership structure has millions of people and they're all looking towards a person rather than an ideal to lead them, then when that person leaves, it makes it very difficult to make the transition to the next person, right? This was the biggest danger with let's say the modern presidency since the invention of the 24-hour news cycle is they decide whether or not they like the president, and if it's CNN and they're Democrat, they do. If it's Fox and they're Republican, they do. And then they just kind of push that, and you get a cult of personality, which makes transitions increasingly difficult to stick. And the brilliance of the American system actually has been the ability to facilitate a predictable 4-year cycle of revolutions, where a new leadership comes in every 4 years, and maybe you keep the guy for another 4. Sometimes one time we had FDR for 16 years or so, or however many years it was. But generally, every 4 years, you have the chance to peacefully have a revolution through voting. But as the cult of personality gets there, and that office is given more and more power because of that cult of personality, that becomes less like a revolution and more like a coup every 4 years.
Still on values, and Will Katie, who's the global director of Reddit's internal creative agency, just tweeted, "Remember the human, empower communities, keep Reddit real, privacy is a right, believe in the good." And that's been their internal value system since Reddit was founded, to my knowledge. I think it might be a little bit later. But what's interesting is that they only started telling other people that was all.
Yeah.
That was all inner governance. It was never outer governance, which kind of, I don't know, to me explains a lot of the gap in how they've had their communication breakdown. And same thing, right? Like they've had kind of leaders that have switched, and like, all right, here's the new fucking person, like whatever. And
There's
and
never
you see
really
this,
been a Zuckerberg of Reddit.
right? Well, and
There's never
even
been a Jack
it's
Dorsey
like
of Reddit.
there's like Zuckerberg is Putin, and like Steve Huffman is Biden, like loosely. And it's
Jack
like
Dorsey,
you're kind of,
or what's his name? He took over after Jack Dorsey, who's even worse with censorship. He's like the Xi Jinping of social media.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm thinking of is like, I mean, again, me being me, like, how can we build, I don't know,
Well, that's his name.
Stripe for creating a country, right? Like, I would like to create a country. Okay, cool. Would you like a dictatorship? Would you like what kind of country would you like?
I mean, to an extent, though,
and
right?
we could make it so that when you select dictatorship, it says this option is not currently available.
Just because say it's in development.
In development. Dictatorships are in development. Sorry, you can only start a collective.
I mean, when you think about it, though, right? Like the modern capitalist corporation is built off of this very idea, with the exception of saying, we also, will have the right to, we have a monopoly on harm, and we have a monopoly on coercion, and we have the ability to state that anything on the inside of this border and property we run. But you can have corporations with sub-corporations and people building those corporations, people inside the corporations vote to who leads the corporation, and all of these things. There can be resources and assets inside of the corporations. To an extent, that's exactly what you're talking about. Really, is just it's a corporation of people. The difference is that most companies can't form an identity the way that a nation can. And nation states in particular have the ability to do that, but nations are decentralized. They're imagined communities. They only exist in our mind. It's the state that really is given the full umph of a legal structure, and how centralized or decentralized you want to do that, right, depends on how you set up that structure. So doing a cloud country and saying, is there a Stripe for it? Like, there is, but it's Stripe. Like, you could just do this with Stripe. The only thing is that the moment you try and declare sovereignty of your Delaware C Corp, now you have a problem because you're a threat to power to the organization in which you've created that C Corp, which is to say, the state of Delaware and the U.S. government.
What's the difference between that and Bitcoin? Not the barking Bitcoin, but the cryptocurrency.
The decentralized nature and the fact that there's actually not a corporation that is built around it.
So how do you have a decentralized cloud country?
Well, the extent to which you need to say that it exists is the only centralization that you really need.
Well, I mean, Facebook exists in multiple countries.
It seems like another difference would be sort of differentiation of governance or services. I mean, if you had a big enough country, it could do all the things a state does. I'm thinking of infrastructure, health services, army, land borders, that kind of thing. That might be metaphorically true in cloud countries, which raises the interesting question we've come to in these discussions over and over again: the difference between virtual interaction and real world interaction.
Mm-hmm.
Someone said, Lyric Snow said, my brain has no idea what is going on, but I agree. And my response is, we're talking about how to de-radicalize nationalism, TLDR, make everybody get along.
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny because like even that statement, it's like make everyone get along. You can't make people get along.
No,
You can enable people to communicate and therefore be aligned, which is ipso facto getting along.
Yeah.
But language is really important in this.
Setting up the conditions or kind of this sort of structural causation out of which getting along emerges. That's the only way for it to be sustainable.
I love that we
Very
have
much so.
philosophy, ethics, and computer science doctorates present with us. And then also Elise, who's a pro at pouring tea, which I believe she's communicated previously as a practice of holding space for people. Is you guys with your I'm going to spend years in school and get a PhD, and Elise is like, I'm going to get my PhD just by pouring tea. And functionally, like I think again, squint and blink, it's like these things are all the same. So people who are listening, our massive audience of 6 people, it's not it really isn't about this trust in someone else, right? It is very much individual action. I think one of my favorite hold on, let's see if I can pull it up really quickly. There's a quote from Charles Eisenstein in The Ascent of Humanity. The collective transformation of our species can only be the sum of billions of individual transformations, each driven by the intersection of generalized crises within our individual lives.
Mm-hmm.
That's what social simulation, multi-agent artificial intelligence is all about. So showing how those macro level shifts emerge from micro level behaviors and interactions.
Yeah. I mean, and that's really kind of the only, I think, legitimate way to even approach these questions, to be honest, is we have to look at how these individual interactions emerge to create some sort of consensus. And years ago, I can't even remember how many years ago, I guess at this point it's been almost 10 years, I outlined in sort of a theoretical paper how you can do this and how exactly you can even mathematically calculate the kind of consensus that you need in order to create stable identities. And write computer simulation programs that can actually help you to say, oh, well, if this happens, then identities might have a crisis. You might have a social schism, or the group might fall apart, or the group is going to get so overly centralized it's going to become cult-like.
Which paper was that, Justin? Which paper?
So the first one, the theoretical outline, was method theory and multi-agent artificial intelligence. But then there was another one which has the most academic-y title in the history of academic-y titles, which is called, let me see it, hold on. The emergence of almost can't even say it. The emergence of social schemas and lossy conceptual information networks, how information transmission leads to the apparent emergence of culture.
And this is
That's
how my
one
wife's
title.
dissertation has an ellipsis on the book backing.
Exactly. See, this is how it is. But yeah, it was the emergence of social schemas and lossy conceptual information networks. And it was about how you can use a kind of information network called a lossy information network, which comes from things like video compression, information compression, informatics, and cybernetics. It comes from that sort of area, and how you can use that in order to formalize social schemas that emerge from those individual interactions and individual beliefs into something larger that would be a cultural identity or a national identity, for example. And use that as a way where there's a feedback loop between sort of like this emergent cloud consensus, if you will, and the individual actors that align themselves to that cloud consensus. But at a certain point, subsets of those individuals on the network can their beliefs can shift to the point that they no longer identify with this cloud consensus. They have their own cloud consensus that's emerged, and it allows for you to model the schisms of the group with extremely high accuracy. And see sort of where it's going to happen and what sort of like ideological buttons you can push in order to make that happen. But to come full circle with it, it does have an interesting repercussion for a lot of the things we see in the news today. As subgroups inside of nations like Canada and the United States have different beliefs that they have, different identities that they have. Those identities are tied to these like just sort of networks of information, these beliefs that people hold in their brains, that they've learned over time, and they reinforce and they internalize as part of who they are and their identities. And so as those things shift, if they don't all shift together in a human population, that's where you get the sort of like lines in which a schism can break. Alternatively, as those shift, you can also though get people to have more consensus, and they can start to come together, right? So arguably, right, like when you look at the conflict in the Ukraine, there are people that are separatists fighting for Russia in the Ukraine, in Crimea, that have been there for years doing this. And they very much are the opposite of that, right? Even despite being Ukrainian nationals or nationals of whatever country, they align themselves very much with the Russian schema of information. And that's how they form their identity, and they're willing to fight and die for those identities. And so it exists on both sides, and there's both a pull and a push, a fission and a fusion approach to how this works when you play the video out over time.
And identity fusion is really important here, and all of the things we're discussing, because if you have this is the idea that when people's sense of self, the extent to which it's fused with their sense of belonging to the country or the group or the culture or the company or the cloud country,
Hmm.
whatever it is, if they see their sense of self completely fused, then they're more likely to die or to be willing to kill for the sake of their group. But if you have two, most people can't maintain that level of intense fusion
They
identity
never achieve it.
for too long, because motivationally you need to do other things. But then on the other hand, if you don't have people with enough identity, not fusion, but at least identity connection, then there's no cohesion within the group. So there's this back and forth that Justin was talking about. You get too much fusion, and then within your group, then you're more likely to be willing to be antagonistic or violent toward out group members. If you don't have enough identity with your group, it dissolves, sort of falls apart, won't cohere as a group or a nation.
So can you clarify where that identity comes from? I mean, aside from alignment of values, you also mentioned, I guess, a diversion of focus. Was that diversion of focus? Did I hear that correctly? In that it's perhaps, I don't know, I don't want to say monetarily, right? Like, but the ability to maintain one's life.
What I was referring to there is based on what's motivational imbalance theory. So you may be motivated, Brian, to eat really good food, to have a nice job, to make lots of friends, to read books, to you just keep going and keep going, to protect yourself from invasion. But you can't do all of those things all the time with same with all your energy. So most people spend a little bit of time eating, a little bit of time pursuing friends, a little bit of time working. They have a balanced motivations, but under certain conditions, both psychological and economic and other conditions, people become motivationally imbalanced, and they focus almost all or most of their energy in this one thing. They become obsessed, which, I mean, it's also true when you fall in love. You're a kind of extremist, but it can, if it has to do with fusion with a group, then you oh, Bitcoin like that.
Bitcoin.
Then
It
that
broke.
can
It broke for 40,000. What?
yeah. if that fusion becomes motivationally imbalanced toward protecting your group, so your sense of self, your sense of security is based on the security of your group, then if someone insults your group and you're motivationally imbalanced, you'll attack that person instead of saying, all right, I see your point, but now I'm going to go out to
How
eat or read a book or whatever else it might be.
so there's this really great and also dark quote that I love and also am terrified by, but Tristan Harris, he said, the problem with human-centered design is that humans are inherently flawed. So how would one go about building a mechanism for self-governance, right? So like if you agree to a set of values, and so let's say one of the values is do no harm,
Hmm.
and then in theory you have a technological tool that enables you to
Don't
catch
be
yourself.
evil.
Right, when you start to, so like, don't be evil. Let's say, you have a tool for looking at, I don't know, contracts and reading the language and then seeing
Sure.
that the language is very violent.
Hmm.
Is that something that's been tested? Is that something that, in theory would work, right? Because what we're talking about here, it seems that we agree on is individual action, right? Like we all have
Hmm.
to individually make these choices, but we also agree that we are unfortunately human, and we are imperfect, and so you get frustrated, you need to pay your rent, you corrupt your own values because you're an extremist in that moment. We see this a lot with family, right? Like people are all here are my values, and then when something happens in the proximity of their family they
Mm.
completely abandon all of them, like yeah.
So there's a reason for that, though. There are multiple mechanisms for bonding, right? One of them that Laurent mentioned, right, is identity fusion. You basically internalize your group into who you are as a person so strongly you can't tell the difference between your group and yourself. Like literally you become fused, right? That's where they get the word from. The other one is just called social identification, where your group is something that's kind of like out there. It's not in you, it's like it's out there, it's a thing that you say that you belong to, but you can also detach yourself from it, right? And so you see this, for example, when among people like NRA members, when there's a school shooting and the head of the NRA says something ignorant, NRA members go, yeah, I am an NRA member, but I don't believe that. I don't believe that. He might believe that, right? So you can still separate the I from the they from the us, right? Um, and then the third way of bonding basically is through relational ties, where through personal experiences with another individual, your personal memories of that individual shape the relationship. It's not necessarily about what they believe, it's about what you've mutually experienced with them. And this is an extremely intense and sort of evolutionarily speaking, very ancient form of bonding, right? It's the original bonding to kinship and to tribal units. It's also the kind of bonding that is most effective in the military, right? Small scale military units, the studies generally that are done in the military show that the reason why you're willing to fight and die isn't necessarily for any other reason than the fact that you're fighting for the guy next to you, and he's also fighting for you. Is one of the reasons why a lot of veterans have trouble reintegrating into civilian life. The people that they've gone through the worst with and were willing to fight and die for are no longer next to them, and sometimes those brothers in arms gets redeployed and they're at home and they feel guilty about it. Family is very much the same way. It literally it is the same thing from a bonding perspective. You have your brothers and your sisters, your parents, uncles, grandparents, whoever it is that you're close with growing up in your family. A lot of times people will defend the really stupid stuff their family does because they're family, and it has
Yeah.
to do with the fact that their beliefs are not the reason you're bonded. The relationships are the reason they're bonded. Now in the modern world, particularly in the world of COVID, right, it has the lockdowns have severed those relational ties, and social
Yeah.
media has bastardized those relational ties, and it
Mm.
makes it so that it is a it's like a fictitious version of what once was, but it doesn't have the strength of actual real world experiences, which is one of the reasons why I think you started to see in the last 5 to 10 years an increase in reports. And you also see this in studies. The Pew Research Forum has done research on this, for example, on people who are actually willing to break off relationships, both romantic and familial relationships, with people over political disagreements, which is something that is not really something that happened since the Civil War.
Mm. So we're coming up on time-ish, at least for us, because we tend to go long. So I have
15 minutes.
You're right. So I mean, this isn't really a question as much as it is a proposal, and it's certainly not something that we've not discussed. Talk about identity fusion. We talk about mechanisms for de-escalation, mechanisms for healthier bonding, mechanisms for enabling individuals to do their work, their inner work, to be able to acknowledge when they're in a state of fear-based action, or when they're activated so they don't cast that out on someone else and take it out on someone else. I'd love to map this out, because what the Culture Pulse Technologies is based on clinically proven science. So you build algorithms that are based on clinically proven science, and go figure, the algorithms have the ability to predict human behavior to a near clinical degree, because it's entirely based on clinical science. And so you basically just modeled it after that. So what I'd like to do is map out over time, like, what is needed to create it, like everything that's being discussed, right? So identity fusion, which I'm coming to understand. But also, like, okay, you talked about, the bonding of war. Okay, well, is that not also seen in environments like Burning Man, where, like
Yes,
you see
it
how
is.
someone collectively sets something up, and you can see, okay, that person bounced out because they wanted to go drop acid and not help set up camp. So you learn about these people, but war is against, right? So how can we, again, in theory, hey, everyone who's a part of this cloud nation, go and meet up in a localized area and play this game together so that you can create these bonds together. Like, is that, if in theory that is a very integral element to creating this cohesion, then can we manufacture that cohesion through collective consent to participate in something like a game or an activity? I'd be curious to map out what this would look like if we manufactured it, and manufacturing, not to manipulate people to feel this way, or, as I inadvertently said, make everyone get along, right? It's not about making, it's about creating the system, communicating the intentions of the system, and thus getting consent to the system and work towards the manifestation of those intentions.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think one of the key words that you mentioned there actually is that of consent. A lot of groups today, like nation groups, for example, are being held together more by coercion than they are by consent. And that's very dangerous, because as soon as the power structure starts to show cracks, that coercion will break. Right, that is the
Yes.
story of Eastern Europe. That's the story of communism throughout the 1900s. It was originally consensual sometimes, but it very quickly became coercion, and the coercion got worse and worse and worse, and then eventually you see a break in the power and the whole system collapses, and then they have to reframe something under a new consensus, and as that consensus becomes more and more coercive, it will collapse. And whether it's called capitalism or communism doesn't really change the fact that that is the cycle. You can call it whatever you want, but as you centralize the power, that power becomes more about coercion, and the cohesion breaks down because it becomes more about coercion than cooperation and consent.
And bridging out of, I guess, political structures, if I can batch those things within the same bucket, there's the wisdom in a book that I read. There's a very big difference between the teachings of Jesus Christ and the religion that emerged from those teachings, right? And so you see these, I guess, ideals, or whatever, that are corrupted by people who mold them to their own beliefs. And it's interesting I think with, you know, and what I've read, and I wasn't raised, I was raised Jewish, so I've been learning, and it's like the Bible's confusing. Like it's very long. Everything's spoken in like Chantel criticizes
It's all
me for speaking in
archaic.
metaphors and parables all the time, and like I'm like, yeah, it's just how I talk. But like, you know,
You look at
Reddit's
the Bible, you're like,
virtue.
there's literally a book of Psalms.
Yeah, and so like Reddit, you know, one of Reddit's I guess intentions is, you know, remember the human, right? So
Mhm.
if, you know, someone in the nation of Reddit is, let's say, being a dick, you're like, hey man, remember the human. You know, and if that becomes the basis for a collective to respond to an individual who perhaps is in a state of crisis, right? So someone's
Mhm.
being a dick to someone else. The person who's being a dick, you say, hey man, remember the human. Also, how are you doing? And I
Mhm.
think that like the key there is really being simple to understand by any individual versus like, you know, the Bible kind of requires understanding, right? Like I don't know if a 3-year-old would be able to understand the lessons within the Bible without someone else translating it for them. So, you know, then you're also talking about how do you get consent from a greater number of people by making something simpler to communicate. So
Yeah.
the homework here is really to I don't know if I simplify and say that over the course of the last 10 years of both of y'all's research and largely Justin and taking this clinically proven science and creating our algorithms to then simulate societal systems and predict what's going to happen, which we'll call that like understanding. Can we use those same studies and that same understanding to create alignment and create resonance, which we're kind of
Yeah.
doing by showing people, you know, how to understand, for example, Reddit and how to create an ad that is super resonant. But can
Yeah.
we do that on a macro level with
Well,
community?
that's what we're going to find out with the project with Cambridge University that we've landed. That's kind of exactly what that is it's investigating what the role of forgiveness is, but it's not just about creating those communities. It's creating those communities in contexts where very recently these people were just at war. So we stacked the deck against ourselves here. This is not going to be, we didn't go for the easy one,
No.
which is like, let's deal with people who kind of like each other anyways.
Vermont, New Hampshire.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like exactly. Like we're not dealing with Vermont and New Hampshire here. We're literally dealing with people who were in civil wars. We're talking about, Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. We're talking about the different factions throughout the former Yugoslavia. And going in and creating these exact systems and using the culture pulse technology to understand how those conflicts escalated, how they progressed, and then how they ultimately started to die down, by running culture pulse over the news feeds that came out of all of those areas over the course of those conflicts, but then using simulation engines on top of that data to then say, okay, let's give this a network, let's give this, a potential policy, right? Like a literally like a policy that could be enacted by, let's say, Stormont in Northern Ireland, right? They're like their parliament. Or let's see, who could do this in Serbia, right? Serbia is increasingly destabilizing right now. They have nationalism that's on the rise in a very critical and extreme way over the last few years, where people are now denying the genocides that were happening in that region. And so you start to see that's unraveling, and let's see if the AI can reverse that and get it back towards a more peaceful trajectory. So that's kind of exactly what we're doing. We think we have the theoretical tools, and now we think we have most of the technology, but thanks to this, this collaboration with Cambridge, they're gonna help facilitate the final push to kind of make these ends meet when it comes to taking culture
With
pulse, taking news feeds, taking simulation, and then wrapping it up in a way that we can then present it to, top
Yeah.
policymakers in the area.
On that note, um, making the world a better place and showcasing it. I mean, I love all of that, and we're about at time, so I'm trying to find an elegant wrap to this. Excited for next time. We'll be back next week, same time. That's an hour ago, whatever time it is for you listening, or 11 a.m. PST for anyone who is listening to the recording. And yeah, I mean, manufacturing resonance through science and consent. It is really
building peace building, really.
Practicing safe sex. SECTS.
That's right.
It's so weird to say it verbally, because like when you look at the spelling, you're like, haha, that's funny, but then when you speak it,
when you say it,
you got to remember to spell it.
Yeah. For the record, that's the title of one of Laurent's, what are we at now, 20 books?
At 19.
19. I apologize. I didn't mean to project into the future. Get your shit together, Laurent. And make another book out of it.
I'm working on it.
So you can also say between the two of us, we have 3 PhDs and over 20 books, but much like the PhDs, Laurent also has most of the books.
Thank you both for joining us. Elise, thank you for also showing up and being our #1 superfan, short of holding a foam finger. Although we don't know what's below your desk.
She could just start throwing.
Sorry I didn't talk much today. I was doing a lot more listening, but it's a great conversation, and I totally believe that there's a way of creating civilization or nations or proper sects without the need of the systems that we have, make them truly decentralized. So thank you for the work that y'all are doing and the knowledge that you shared with us today. I'm on team.
Thanks,
I'm on board.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Elise. And I just like, it was all this container of like serious, earnest, like gratitude, like interrupted by proper sex. SECTS, as in groupings.
Yeah.
Peaceful groupings.
That's right.
There's plenty of sex within those sects, but we're not talking about that sex. We're talking about... Yeah.
And some sects have more sex than other sects.
Missionaries.
Nailed it. And on that note, I think that's a Costanza. I think get out of here.
And we're done.
Yep, I'm ending the recording on that. Thank you, everyone. See you next week.
Oh, so also Laurent.
Yeah.
On the note of the Cambridge project, I spoke with